Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Miss Valerie Warren from the Participatory Budgeting Project. How are you doing today, Valerie?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for inviting me to your podcast.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure. I'm such a fan of what you guys do with the Participatory Budgeting Project, and I think that your kind of work speaks for itself, and you're right down the road, so I think it's exciting to have something like this so close to where our kind of home base is.
Absolutely. I love Roanoke. It's such a beautiful city, and I used to work at a summer camp based out there, so I have lots of fond memories.
Oh, what camp did you work at out here?
I worked at Teen Adventure Camp, which is part of the Baltimore Yearly Meeting of Friends, and we had a base camp in the foothills around Roanoke. So I've hiked a lot of the Appalachian Trail through there.
Well, it's for those of you that don't know, Roanoke has the most photographed spot on the entire Appalachian Trail outside of it. So you should all come and visit when you come for CityWorks this year. What's your background, Valerie? How did you wind up involved with participatory budgeting stuff?
Absolutely. Well, I've had a long and winding road. I've really been interested in alternative economics and approaches to finding more sustainability in economic systems my whole life. It was in college I studied economics in addition to sociology and focused on international studies just so I could learn as much as possible about different ways that communities work to meet their own needs. So it's been an abiding interest. Since then, I've been involved with lots of different kinds of professional work and project management and coordinating of programs, both in nonprofit and for-profit sectors. And in addition to that, I've been a community organizer, and I've been involved with a lot of different approaches to social justice and racial and economic justice. So through that process, I was first exposed to participatory budgeting about 2 or 3 years ago when folks in my community here in Greensboro, North Carolina, started organizing to try and win PB for our city. And to start with, they started holding small participatory processes and events where we would make choices to allocate small buckets of funds for local informal community groups. And then they continued to work and organize and won it so that a resolution was passed by the Greensboro City Council to start a PB process, which actually began in 2015. And so that was the first process in the United States, which was 100% the result of community organizing, and there wasn't an individual elected official who brought it to the public fund, and it was the first one in the South. So I'm really proud to be a chance to be part of it now.
Very cool. So when you kind of started working on this stuff, and people were asking, what is participatory budgeting, or I'm sure people still ask that, but especially in the beginning, kind of how did you define that, and how do you define the benefits of that for folks?
Great. Well, a really easy question that we ask, especially when we're out in the streets doing canvassing, is, would you like to help decide how to spend $500,000? So basically, here in Greensboro, I work out of the principle that when the people who are most impacted are involved in deciding how funds should be used, then that's how we make the very best decisions. So I support people across the city of Greensboro to participate in deciding how to spend $100,000 per district to do capital projects in their district. And I also work to support communities across the South who are organizing to win PB.
And when you're in that, I imagine the conversations are very different depending upon who you're talking to. Like, it's like when you go to the city, when you're going to Greensboro or Birmingham or Roanoke, and you want to say, we think that you should include the people in this process of budgeting for X amount of money. How does that conversation go, and how do you define it for the government so that they get on board with it?
Well, yeah, it's actually something that most of our interest initially comes from elected officials. because they know that inviting people into making decisions that affect their lives is a really important way to build trust. So for a lot of folks who are candidates or who are on city councils, on county commissions, who serve as mayors, or who are working in other places where they're allocating public funds, they know that they can build trust with their constituents when they are accountable to them, and participatory budgeting makes the entire process of how decisions are made visible. When they're transparent, the rules are clear and available to folks who want to be involved, and when they get to engage on an ongoing basis. Most places, if you want to join a budget meeting, whether it's with, your school board or your county commissioners or your state legislature or whatever, that involves going to a meeting set at the time that's convenient to the elected, sitting and waiting usually until it comes up on the agenda. And then you may, if there's a public comment period, have a couple minutes to speak. You make your statement and then you leave. Well, in participatory budgeting, there's many opportunities to share your ideas, to hear from other people what they want and why it's important to them. And then when we make decisions in the voting process at the end, you're not just voting for one thing and then everything else misses out. You actually usually have an array of choices, and you vote, and the votes are counted, and all of the top projects win and are funded. So it's less competitive and exclusive than, say, voting for a bond referendum up or down.
I'm intrigued how you've seen this play out in Greensboro in terms of, you were able to get it approved and now you've got some time into it. So how do you think it's changed the relationship between the community and the government in that place?
Well, I think it's really great because I actually get to work extensively with a lot of city employees who are working really hard to implement PB and to make it better each year. And what I've seen is that from when it was first proposed to now here in the midst of our second cycle, there are a lot of people who really believe in it and who really champion it and work really hard and kind of go above and beyond to be able to make sure that it works. And so, city employees are very often already seeking input and trying to get feedback from communities. They have responsibility to do so. They do a lot of documentation to show that it takes place. But it's really hard if the only funding that's coming into a city for new projects comes from bond referendums, and it may be 5 or 10 years from when it's voted on to when the funds are released for implementation. And so they spend a lot of time seeking input, fielding questions, and having conversations with folks in the community, but they don't have a lot of power to make it actually happen, which can actually make that more stressful. So a lot of what I've seen is city employees who see this as a great chance to build their relationships and to be more effective with responsibilities they already have, to not just get input, but to turn around and to show the results of that input within a clear time frame. And that also, goes along with the fact that most city budgets don't get bigger year over year. They may be the total dollar amount does, but because populations are growing, a lot of folks are moving to the South, the actual budgets for programs get less and less. And so that makes that challenge even harder.
That's really fascinating, especially because we've seen here locally, we've seen this, and I think everywhere in the country we're seeing communities grapple with especially the threat of online shopping and what that means for local tax bases and things along those lines. So I wonder, when you're looking at a community's budget, so wherever that be, what are kind of the things that you think stand out, or what is important when you're looking at to understand when you're looking at a community's budget?
Sure. Well, I think number one is that it's usually really complex and difficult to gain a full understanding of it. So participating in participatory budgeting gives folks a chance to take it bit by bit and to learn by doing, and by doing in a way that they have a reason to believe resources will come to their communities, the ins and outs of how budget decisions are made. So, so starting with just having an opportunity to break down and experience and learn deeply how budgets work and how decisions around budget work is really important. But I'm sure you've heard the expression that budgets show the values of those who write them. And the reality is, in proportion to the number of people who live in a city or in another place that a public funds are used, the number of people who participate in writing the budgets is usually far less. And so you'll see budgets that are very different from what a lot of people want. And, an example of that is in a lot of places, public safety will take up the majority of the budget, and public safety is expressed in policing. But in the study of our PB processes across North America for the past 5 years, that's one of the least frequently mentioned uses of public funds when we go to the community and ask them what they think is important and what the funds should be spent on. It's very rare for people to suggest public safety in the form of policing or surveillance as a use of public funds that a community really needs. A lot more frequently, you'll hear people mention transportation safety and access, such as pedestrian access, improving access to sidewalks and street crossings that are more safe, improving safety at public transportation sites by making sure there's shelters and clearly marked places to wait, improving facilities and public spaces so that they are available for communities to gather and for families and children to be together and to experience the outdoors in a safe way, are much more frequent expressions of community priority. And you'll see a big difference between that and the vast amounts of budgets that are spent on policing.
It's really interesting. Do you think that, so obviously both sides then can come to a better understanding of what everybody wants. Do you feel like there's also a component of this that allows the public to see the complexity of these issues so that we know that when you have to take all of these things into account, it becomes a lot, you have to think about transportation, but you also have to think about schools and about, economic development and things along this line. Do you find that this process also helps the community to better understand how all those things play together?
Absolutely. There's a tremendous amount of understanding that goes both ways. And this kind of goes back to your question earlier, staff of governments and public institutions that use PB, because it can definitely be used for more than just city budgets, start to really like and support PB, even though it changes the way they do their work, because it raises so much understanding in the community around how the decisions they make are made. When folks get into the proposal development phase and they start to learn all of the considerations that city governments or public funds have to make when they're administering funds, then they understand and they have empathy for that, and they also tend to work really hard to make good decisions and make the most of the resources that we have. One of the things that tends to happen throughout the process is because there are so many places for input, the first stage is planning, where when a community starts to do PD, they actually plan how the process works in their community and make sure it works the best. So there's a conversation that happens about what is the most important need for this process. How do we meet the goals of our process in terms of equity and access and transparency and accountability? And then from there, when they start the actual process and they start to collect ideas, people get to share an idea with the government or share an idea with their community members and talk about why it's important to them. And then they may get feedback that, it doesn't work for this reason or this reason. For example, you want to make a change to the crossing on that road. Well, that road is actually managed by the state, not the local government. And in order to increase access to the community, then you start looking at another place. And so it's that interplay between this is what we need and these are the requirements that we fit, and and that people who are committed to developing ideas are very creative and then use that to meet the need according to the budget, to meet the need according to restrictions, and they bring a lot of insight and ability to talk and gather more of an understanding of how it will work the best, that extends the capacity of city staff and makes sure that when the funds are used, they do what they're supposed to do.
What kind of tools do you guys use so you guys let the communities dictate how they kind of go through the process? But crucial to this is making sure that you have kind of the right people at the table and a good broad group of people at the table. How do you guys encourage communities to make that happen?
Sure. Well, there are some, each community adapts PB to the needs of that community, and it also depends on the budget it's being used in. Participatory budgeting can be used to allocate any budget. I've used it with my kids and to decide how we're going to use money on a Saturday out of our personal family entertainment budget to come to a decision about what we do that pleases both of my kids and the other kids who are coming along with us. So it works for any budget of any size. And the first step is for people to understand the terms of that budget. So if it's a school board budget, if it's a city council district, if it's federal funds, if it is a community development block grant, if it's funding for a specific PTA at a high school, you just need to understand what are the restrictions of those funds. And that information is usually shared from staff to the community members who are appointed to act as a steering committee, which helps make decisions. From then, you set goals for the process and principles. The core principles of participatory budgeting that we share as an organization are direct democracy and direct democratic practices, that it's not about electing people to represent you, it's about supporting as many people as possible to access the process itself. Because we believe that when the people who are most impacted participate, that's how you get the best decisions. So, and then equity, that we're not just assessing, is it fair, as in, are we doing the same thing to each person or for each person, but we're considering ongoing questions of equity. And the way I explain that in trainings is if everyone comes to a training and they all get a packet of cookies as a snack, and one person got taken out to dinner and ate a full dinner and dessert and comes to the meeting and isn't hungry at all, I give him a pack of cookies and he really doesn't care. Maybe he doesn't want to offend me and give it back, so he takes it with him and leaves it in his car and forgets about it. So that's wasted. And then the next person has come straight to their job where they didn't get a break to eat for the last 6 hours. They didn't have a time to stop because they were rushing to get here. They couldn't leave early. And I give them the cookies, and it's not even really enough. They're still hungry, and it's hard for them to listen because their focus is on, I wish I had another pack of cookies. So giving them exactly the same thing is not necessarily the best use of our resources, right? It probably would have been more effective in terms of meeting community needs to give one person 2 packs of cookies and the other person 0. And they both would have appreciated the outcome better. But it's really difficult to have those conversations. And the reality is we're not dealing just with packs of cookies, but we're dealing with communities impacted with long-term legacies, such as, racial discrimination, which caused redlining from bank loans and realtors, so that there are very real differences in the physical makeup of communities, and those conditions have impacts over years. So, we know those impacts exist. It's really difficult to have enough of the kind of complex conversations that are needed to come up with solutions. But luckily, through a participatory budgeting process, some of the tools we use are, offering definitions of equity and need, creating trainings and research on available data so that we know we're basing decisions in actual data on the communities we're in, as well as supporting them to convene conversations to seek community input, and offering training and tools such as a rubric to actually create an assessment so that the teams can work together to discuss these things, assign scores to them, and then collectively decide how to prioritize when we're considering things like feasibility, impact, need, and equity. So, we have a lot of tools to help take some of those complex conversations and turn them into decision-making efforts that move communities forward in tackling really complex issues.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Well, I am intrigued, because I think that there's definitely a balance that you're mentioning there between the need for some education, but also the need to make sure everybody's voice is heard and to hear new perspectives on things. So I wonder, how do you guys ensure that, there are certain very unsexy ideas, for lack of a better term, that I think people would worry about not being funded from something like this. And so how do you make sure that, I think an example that comes to mind is that, a lot of the research that's coming out suggests that when you do Section 8 housing or anything like that, when you separate it and put it in many different places in the community as opposed to in one particular place, you have better outcomes. But that's not something that necessarily people in the community know, or they may intuitively know it. How do you kind of bring that educational component to bear and make sure that people have the knowledge they need to make informed decisions on these questions?
Well, I think that the key word there is outcomes, and when you say better outcomes, then you'd have to be able to dig in and really understand, what is the better outcome we're looking for. From some people's perspective, the best outcome is to constantly reduce public budgets. Well, in that case, reducing the total amount of funds spent on public housing is a good outcome. However, from the perspective of people who live in communities in which there's a severe housing crisis, that's not necessarily the better outcome. And when you put it in a broader context, such as, the lack of housing is causing, children not to be able to attend school. The lack of housing is causing people not to be able to enter the workforce. The lack of housing is causing severe medical problems. Sure, your best outcome, if your only measurement is the total dollar amount on the budget, is to reduce the number of people in public housing, but that's not necessarily the best outcome for the community. The difference there would be, what you are actually seeking to create in your community. And if what you seek is a healthy community where children are able to attend school, where people are able to, not experience physical illnesses, where you have a workforce that's ready to engage, then that outcome is not necessarily the one you want. What you want is the presence of plentiful, affordable, safe, quality housing. And so what PB actually does is we advocate for transparency and accountability and access and input, and those principles allow people to engage and set goals as a community and express priorities as a community. So, what we do is actually foster conversation in which people in a community can say, what does our community need, and have the resources to make it happen. So, part of that requires trusting that people know what they are experiencing in their lives and can represent that, so that we're not making an external judgment on their ability to know what they need. A lot of folks will say that people are apathetic. I don't think that's true. I think that people have a lot of different commitments in their lives, some of which may be overwhelming. But we've learned through PB that when we're present and accessible, there's a tremendous amount of passion that can be unleashed, and that people will work really hard to create to create projects and proposals that have huge impacts on their communities.
Well, I'm intrigued. Really, what it sounds like in some ways that you think the perhaps the biggest part of what you're doing is creating a shared vision in some ways, which I imagine can be very difficult at times. But is that something that I imagine that being very inspirational to be around when it's happening in process? Has that been so?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, in my experience, it happens all the way through the process. From the very beginning. While we were doing idea collection, which we did from March, from the very end of March through May, we were out everywhere we could be with teams of volunteers and with staff, having conversations about participatory budgeting and inviting folks to submit ideas as well as to volunteer as budget delegates for the next phase. And if you've ever been involved in canvassing or clipboarding or outreach work, it can be really hard, because you've got to start a conversation with someone you weren't already talking to and hope that they're interested. Well, I've done a lot of that kind of work. And in my experience doing it for PB, it's really amazing how quickly people catch on that it's something they want to be involved in. And an example is I was at my son's track meet, and, if you've ever been to a high school or middle school track meet, you know that you're watching 2-minute races and waiting around for 10 or 15 minutes for the next one to start. So there's plenty of time to talk. And, and I would just, talk to people, let them know I was a parent, but also I was doing outreach, and it's something I wanted to share information about it. And I had a tremendous number of great conversations with people who instantly clicked with the idea that they would, be able to participate in decisions that really impact their community and wanted to be involved. So, that's really inspirational and rewarding when you're out there pounding the pavement to just have so many great conversations. And then, when we facilitate brainstorming sessions in the community, people build on each other's ideas and connect to each other's ideas and are extremely creative in developing them into, new potential projects that can really make our city look and act differently. So each point in which we're able to listen and share authentically and then experience working with resources to try to make it happen, it can be very challenging, but it releases a lot of energy and interest, and people, keep coming back and keep being involved in making it happen.
Do you think that part of what the goal for you guys is to make democracy more interactive in some ways and take it from just going to the voting booth to being much more of an engaging and real process for people to engage in?
Yeah, and some of it is just, that some of this just takes more time. And the reality is when we're talking with a city or a community that's interested in starting PB, one of the first questions is, isn't this a lot of work? And the answer is yes. It is a lot of work, but what our current process is also a lot of work. We've got folks working extremely hard at every stage of the political process, but we also have people feeling discouraged and cynical at increasingly higher rates. And as a society, we need to know how to live and make decisions together. Every answer cannot come from a fight. We actually need to learn to deliberate, and we need to learn to communicate and this provides plenty of opportunities to practice those skills.
Very interesting. So it's, you guys, I think, are doing tremendous work, and it's constantly spreading. What do you think kind of the next phase for what you guys are doing looks like?
Well, we're excited about a number of places across the South and across the United States that we're in a moment where there's a lot of people who have been involved with grassroots organizing and community work, who recognize that in order to be able to create the communities and to develop, where they want to go, they're going to need to have political power. And so there's a lot of people who are using PB as a tool to help increase accountability from elected officials to the community, because it has these structures for convening community conversations, and because it includes mechanisms of accountability where you can actually see how a budget decision was made. That's very rare, In addition, there's a lot of people who are already elected who know that in order to regain trust and to continue to function as a community, that they've got to learn how to build with their community. So we have a lot of interest from elected officials and folks in positions where they're already in the power to make some of these decisions, that are reaching out to us and wanting to learn more about tools they can use to foster dialogue and meaningful input from the community. So it's very popular and continues to get more popular as people keep thinking how to solve the challenges we're facing, around civic engagement.
I mean, there's a word in there that I think stuck out to me because it's, I think, so important, and I don't think we've touched on it yet, but that's just the amount of trust required to make this work is huge. And I think that it is the same for every community project in some ways. But can you talk a bit about how this builds trust, or why trust is so important for this process?
Sure. I mean, basically, it builds trust because it has actual mechanisms for accountability and transparency. And those words get used a lot. What it means is that it is clear that the ways the decisions are made are clear and anyone can see them. The community members form a steering committee and write the rules of the process, which are published. The way from the point at which ideas are submitted to when they're developed as a proposal to when they're implemented to when they're voted on, the people who are involved are known, and the decision that is made regarding the funds is very clear at the end of a budgeting process. That's very unusual. Usually in public budgets, there's a few people involved with presenting the budget. They present a document that is hundreds of pages long with probably thousands of line items. The electeds who approve it or disapprove it, usually have only a few weeks, if that, to review the entire thing. And so it's really not clear, whose values are represented there. And there's no answer. They don't come back and say, we submitted this line item around zoning and taxation because it was suggested by this group. It takes a lot of research to find that out. So the number one is just being open and accountable about who and how the decisions are made. And then second, it's being willing to again trust that people actually know what they need. And when a politician or an elected official, supports a decision to make public funds accountable through a participatory process, the people who know that elected made that decision learn to trust them more because they are being trusted. So trust engenders trust, and it's important because it allows us the space to work together and to actually believe each other when we say. It's very tiring to question constantly whether or not we can believe what people are saying. And it's important to our communities because the amount of time it takes to engage in decision making when trust doesn't exist, or to clean up the pieces afterwards, is difficult and requires resources and results in a lot of real live suffering for a lot of people.
Absolutely. It's I think that you hit on all the important parts. It's just really, there's nothing I think that can ruin a community more than a lack of trust, or faster than a lack of trust in many ways. Now you've lived, I think, several different places. Is that right?
Well, I grew up in Northern Virginia, but I moved down to Greensboro in 1992, and I've pretty much lived here since then. I had a stretch in the Bay Area, but that wasn't very long. So I've been to a lot of places through travel, but I've really spent most of my life here in the South and divided between Virginia and North Carolina. So.
Well, I'm intrigued that when you visit another place, what are the things that you kind of look for in those communities, and what kind of tips you off that, hey, this is a place that is interesting and that I might want to spend more time in?
Sure. Well, I'm very curious, and I love to hear from people, what their lives are like. I love to travel and I like to travel and be in down-home restaurants and in communities, and not necessarily in the fancy chain restaurants and things like that. So I'm really curious, and I like to hear from the people who live there what they like most about where they live, and I'm also really curious about different governments and how they operate, and what that means for who's involved in decision making. And so, with regards to like healthy and thriving, a lot of the indicators of healthy and thriving communities are really visible. When I go, for example, I was just in the Bay Area in California on a business trip 2 weeks ago, and I lived there back in the late 90s, and I was there visiting, about 5 years ago, and it's really shocking for all of the incredible wealth that flows from the technology industries in that area, the number of people living in tents on the street, and the huge differences in communities from, I kept asking as we were driving around and going and visiting and things like that, like how much do houses cost here? Like this looks like my neighborhood, how much do houses cost here? And it's just breathtaking how expensive it is just to live. I think I read a report a year or two that the average cost of housing per square foot in San Francisco is like $2,000 per square foot and per month or something. I don't know. I don't want to quote that because I'm probably totally wrong, but it's just really breathtaking to see, for all of the wealth that's there, all of the struggle that people are also experiencing, and even in the difference in just the past 5 years from then till now. And in places, where you can see physically the condition of roads and the condition of bridges and the conditions of public spaces. These are things that were matters of pride. And after the Great Depression, every major highway and bridge that was built had a name and was in someone's honor. And now the only things that we see that are named in someone's honor are named after a company, and I believe that companies are important. I used to work for a large company, but I feel like that's a big shift in our public pride and the, it no matter what happens, if you build a major highway or build a major road or build a major park, that's an accumulation of resources that takes the contribution of large numbers of people, and that kind of community effort used to be a major source of pride that a community would build, and they would name in the honor of someone who was important to the community. Now we see these places are only paid for when a private entity gets involved, and I think that's a big shift, and it makes a big impression on me. So, to me, health and vitality comes when there's a variety of people of different experiences who are having their needs met. And when we see these indicators of a huge difference in people's experience, that makes me wary about what's going on here and what are the issues people are facing. And, as wonderful as the Bay Area of California is, I could never live there just because I could never afford it, and that's true for an increasing number of people. So
interesting. I particularly like this idea of what kind of things we celebrate in our communities as being important. That's a really interesting way to look at it. And I think it's something that I haven't necessarily thought about, but it's certainly something I see. So that when the difference between the Verizon Center versus the Arthur Ashe memorials are a big deal in some ways, and I think that's a really apropos way of saying it shows what we value in some ways, like our budgets do. But now you've been involved in kind of community organizing, as you mentioned, for a while, and you've been involved with PB for a little while. So can you share some of the stuff that you've learned from working in communities and trying to create better communities along the way?
Sure. I think that you can never underestimate the power of listening. That when you're working on a really big issue, actually spending time, and it's very time consuming, but it's so important to spend as much time listening to different folks who are involved in the process as you can, and that when we support people to be involved and to actually speak to their experience and to listen to one another, it creates a tremendous number of options. And that when I'm facing a really difficult issue, I try to gather as much information as possible. And when because inevitably I find that brings us to opportunities we wouldn't have seen before. So one of the things I really like about participatory budgeting is the structure, that there's actually, if you go to our website, you can look at resources that we have on our website, and we've got all of these guides for facilitating a conversation, for doing outreach to get people to a conversation. We've got sample flyers, sample agendas, meeting plans, talking about how and when and where to schedule meetings. So there's a lot of information and structures that you can use just to engage people in conversation. And then, the struggle then is you have all these different perspectives, you have all these viewpoints, how you synthesize them and move them forward. And I've seen a lot of work get stuck at that point. So this next piece of, the tools we have for doing research and using open source data to understand what's going on beyond the people who are directly involved, but on a broader demographic scale. And the tools we have for decision matrices, so we can assign scales and values to certain things and calculate them as a way for us to see, what are the impacts of the decisions we're proposing, and how do we connect those impacts with the values we say that we have as a group. So I think those kinds of tools are really helpful, and I'm always one to use a tool that looks useful from wherever I find it. And so I'm really excited about getting the chance to practice and to support other folks to learn about and practice these tools as well.
Well, I agree with you. Listening, I think, has to be at the core of everything we do, because if there's no faster way to get off track in some ways than to not listen to the signs of what you're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wonder, as we come to a close here, if you could kind of share a story that you think encapsulates how a community should work, or what happens when a community is working well.
Sure. I think that the hardest part about this is actually picking one. and I would compare, if you've ever been at dinner with someone and maybe it's another couple and they're not talking to each other, and so you're sitting there at dinner and they're not directly talking to one another, and it's very awkward, and maybe they're each talking to you, but they're not talking to each other. And so, you know, when I even describe that situation, it makes me kind of inwardly cringe. And in some ways, you know, we see that happening in so many communities where you've got, you know, people who are in positions of power talking to each other and people who are out in the community talking to each other, but the direct conversation doesn't happen very much, you know. So, you know, last night I was sitting in a budget delegate meeting, and we had city staff as well as folks who are volunteering as budget delegates talking together and really digging into ideas that had been proposed about the community. And at the beginning of our process here in March, we had a community kickoff, and we had city council members, we had community members who were interested in submitting ideas in this year's process, and we had, you know, over 20 people who worked in different departments of the city talking for about 3 hours, you know, and our program was really only 15 minutes long, where we talked and hosted any kind of a formal presentation. The rest of the time it was, you know, completely busy with people talking to each other, learning about how the city works, generating new ideas, and listening to hear from one another what's important to them. So that was really exciting and hopeful to me. And to me, those kinds of active conversations and the listening and curiosity that happens there is just tremendous. And I felt really lucky to be able to focus on and be in that space in a year that's been really scary and frustrating and threatening to so many people.
Mm. What a tremendous example to end on, and it's inspiring, kind of the work that you guys are doing. So thank you so much. And for those of y'all that are interested in the work that Valerie is doing and the work that Participatory Budgeting Process is doing, our project, I said it again, check it out at participatorybudgeting.org. And for those of y'all interested in CityWorks Expo, you can check us out at cityworksexpo.com. And thank you so much for taking the time today, Valerie. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the day for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.